The candlelight flickered against stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the wooden pews of the First Baptist Church of Milledgeville, Georgia. Easter Sunday, 1852. The air hung thick with magnolia blossoms and the weight of unspoken prayers. In the front rows, plantation owners adjusted their finest silks and pressed cottons, their faces painted with the serene confidence of the righteous. Behind them, in the shadows of the back pews, sat their human property, the enslaved souls who had built this very sanctuary with their bleeding hands. The golden chalice gleamed on the altar, filled with deep crimson wine that caught the morning, light like liquid rubies. Soon it would pass from lip to lip, carrying with it the promise of salvation, the blood of Christ shared among the faithful. But on this particular Easter morning, something else swirled within that sacred vessel. Something that would transform communion into catastrophe, salvation into judgment. The congregation rose as one, their voices lifting in harmony, unaware that among them moved a shadow with purpose, darker than the Georgia clay. Ruth stood among the enslaved, her head bowed, her lips moving silently. Not in prayer, but in counting the minutes until the wine would reach trembling hands, until throats would burn with something far more bitter than redemption. What happens when the very cup of salvation becomes the vessel of reckoning? What drives a soul to poison the holy chalice itself? The answer lay buried beneath decades of chains, beneath the magnolia trees that had witnessed unspeakable horrors, beneath the hymns that masked screams in the night. Ruth's story began long, before this Easter morning, in a world where humanity was bought and sold like cotton, where the same hands that raised the communion cup also wielded the whip. Born into bondage on the Hartwell plantation, she had learned early that God's love, as preached from southern pulpits, came with conditions that her skin could never meet. The weight of iron shackles had shaped her bones, but it was the weight of false piety that had shaped her soul. The red Georgia earth had drunk the sweat of her childhood, the tears of her mother, the blood of her father who dared to learn letters. Beneath the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, Ruth had grown from girl to woman, watching the seasons change while her circumstances remained eternally fixed. Summer heat that wilted the cotton also wilted hope. Winter cold that killed the crops also killed dreams. Spring rains that nourished the soil also nourished rage. The plantation house stood like a white temple against the green landscape, its columns reaching toward heaven while its foundations rested on hell. Inside, Master Hartwell read scripture. At breakfast, his voice rich and melodious as he spoke of love and forgiveness. Outside, the overseer's whip sang a different hymn entirely. The contradiction lived in every breath Ruth drew. The master who spoke of turning the other cheek while his overseers broke cheekbones, who preached of feeding the hungry while his human property subsisted on scraps. Ruth possessed a mind, sharp as shattered glass, hidden behind eyes that had learned the art of empty staring. She observed everything, the way fear flickered across faces when the master's mood darkened, the way prayers died on lips when the auction block beckoned, the way even the strongest men crumbled when children were sold away. Her intelligence was both blessing and curse, allowing her to see the full scope of the machine that ground human souls into profit. The nights brought no peace, only different horrors. In the slave quarters, mothers sang lullabies that were really coded warnings. Fathers told stories that mapped escape routes through metaphor, and the old ones whispered of Africa, that distant dream that lived more in memory than reality. Ruth listened to it all, storing each whisper like ammunition for a war she didn't yet know she would fight. What breaks a spirit enough to poison the holy chalice? Perhaps the better question was, what keeps a spirit whole enough to strike back? Sunday mornings arrived with the sound of the plantation bell, calling the enslaved to worship the same God who supposedly blessed their bondage. The First Baptist Church of Milledgeville opened its doors to all souls, though some souls sat in velvet cushions, while others stood on splinter-rough floors. The hypocrisy hung in the air like smoke from the altar candles, visible to anyone with eyes to see. Ruth had memorized every inch of that sanctuary. The way sunlight fell through windows, depicting scenes of biblical liberation that would never apply to her, the carved angels whose wooden faces bore expressions of sorrow that matched her own, the golden chalice that gleamed like a promise perpetually broken. She knew the rhythm of the service by heart, the opening hymn that declared all souls equal before God, followed immediately by the sermon that explained why some souls were more equal than others. The communion ritual held special torment. "Take, eat, this is my body broken for you," the preacher would intone, while the enslaved stood watching their own bodies being broken daily. "Drink, this is my blood shed for you," he continued, while their blood watered the cotton fields. The wine passed from white hands to white hands, each sip a mockery of the very salvation it claimed to represent. Ruth watched the communion cup with growing fascination, seeing in it not the blood of Christ, but the blood of her people. Week after week, she studied its passage through the congregation, noting who drank first, who lingered longest, who closed their eyes in ecstatic reverence. The chalice became her obsession, that golden vessel that united the faithful in their shared delusion of righteousness. In the plantation kitchen, where Ruth worked under the watchful eye of the cook, she learned the alchemy of survival. Which roots eased pain, which leaves fought fever, which bark brought sleep to the tormented. The enslaved had always been their own physicians, treating wounds that masters preferred to ignore, curing ailments with knowledge passed down through generations of suffering. But some plants held darker secrets. In the shadowed corners of the kitchen garden grew foxglove, beautiful and deadly. In the swamplands beyond the plantation borders, water hemlock raised its innocent white flowers while poison pooled in its roots. The old cook, a woman whose back bore the scars of 1,000 lashes, knew these secrets and whispered them to Ruth like prayers to a vengeful God. "Knowledge is power," the old woman said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Even for us, especially for us." Her gnarled fingers pointed to various plants, teaching Ruth the difference between healing and harming, between mercy and judgment. The lessons came wrapped in warnings, but Ruth heard only possibility. Winter nights provided cover for darker education. While the plantation slept, Ruth ground leaves by candlelight, learning the precise measurements that separated medicine from murder. Her hands, skilled from years of cooking and cleaning, now learned a different craft entirely. She practiced with drops of harmless bitter herbs in leftover wine, watching how quickly they dissolved, how completely they disappeared into the deep, red liquid. The preparation became ritual, each step performed with the reverence of prayer. She wrapped the precious powder in scraps of cloth torn from her own dress, hiding them in places only she would think to look. The approaching Easter season gave urgency to her work, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, when communion wine would flow most freely, when the congregation would be largest, when the impact would be greatest. Easter Sunday dawned clear and warm, the Georgia air thick with the perfume of blooming dogwood and the promise of resurrection. Ruth dressed carefully in her one good dress, the same rough cotton she wore every Sunday, but this morning it carried hidden cargo that made her heart race with anticipation and terror. The powder rested against her ribs, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath her bodice where no searching hand would find it. The walk to church felt different, each step carrying her closer to a moment that would shatter everything. Around her, the enslaved community moved in its usual subdued procession, heads down, voices quiet, preparing for another morning of forced worship. They had no idea that this Easter would be unlike any other in the history of Georgia. The church bells pealed across the countryside, their bronze voices calling the faithful to witness what they believed would be Christ's triumph over death. Instead, they would witness death's triumph over faith, judgment's victory over mercy. The irony was not lost on Ruth. Easter, the celebration of resurrection, would become a day of multiple deaths. Inside the sanctuary, the familiar rhythm began. Hymns rose toward the painted ceiling, voices blending in harmonies that masked the discord beneath. The preacher took his place behind the pulpit, his face glowing with the particular fervor that Easter morning always brought. He spoke of sacrifice and redemption, of blood shed for the salvation of all mankind, of course, who qualified for such grace. Ruth's position in the back of the church provided perfect vantage. She could see everything, the plantation families in their Easter finery, the children fidgeting in starched collars, the enslaved community standing like shadows against the wall. Most importantly, she could see the communion table, draped in white linen, where the golden chalice waited like a trap set for the unsuspecting. The moment came with agonizing slowness. As the preacher lifted the bread and spoke the ancient words, Ruth's hand moved to her bodice, fingers finding the small package that would change everything. The congregation bowed their heads in prayer, and in that moment of collective blindness, Ruth stepped forward. Years of kitchen work had taught her to move without sound, to accomplish tasks while seeming invisible to white eyes. She approached the communion table during the prayer, when all heads were bowed and all eyes were closed. Her hand trembled as she reached for the chalice, its golden surface warm to the touch. The wine within looked like liquid garnets, beautiful and pure. The powder dissolved instantly, vanishing into the wine without trace or scent. Ruth stepped back into the shadows just as the congregation raised their heads, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. What she had done could not be undone. The wine was tainted, the trap was set, and Easter Sunday would become a day of reckoning. The communion began as it always did, with the deacons and their families first to partake. Ruth watched with fascination and horror as familiar faces approached. The table lifted the cup to their lips and drank deeply of what they believed was salvation. The wine passed from person to person, each sip bringing them closer to the judgment Ruth had prepared. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The ritual continued with its usual solemnity, voices raised in hymns of praise and thanksgiving. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something changed. A cough here, a stumble there, a hand pressed to a suddenly burning throat. The first to fall was Deacon Morrison, his face flushing red as he clutched his chest and sank to his knees. Panic spread through the congregation like wildfire. Women screamed as their husbands collapsed. Children wailed as their parents doubled over in agony. The sacred sanctuary became a scene of chaos and terror. Easter finery stained with vomit and sweat, prayers for salvation replaced by screams for mercy. The enslaved community pressed against the walls, watching their oppressors writhe in torment, unsure whether to feel horror or satisfaction. Some rushed forward to help, their humanity intact despite their treatment. Others stood frozen, witnessing what felt like divine judgment finally delivered. Ruth remained motionless in the shadows, her face a mask of studied concern that revealed nothing of the storm raging in her soul. She had done this thing. She had poisoned the cup of salvation itself. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a burial shroud, heavy and permanent. The church bells rang out across Milledgeville, but not in celebration. This time they carried news of catastrophe, calling for doctors, for help, for anyone who might save the dying. The Easter morning that should have proclaimed victory over death instead became a day when death stalked the aisles of God's house, claiming victims with the very wine meant to promise eternal life. By evening, 7 were dead, and twice that number lay sick unto death. The beautiful sanctuary reeked of sickness and fear, its white walls stained with the evidence of judgment delivered through the most sacred of rituals. The golden chalice sat empty on the altar, its beauty now tainted by the memory of what it had carried. In the hours that followed, whispers began to circulate. Who could have done such a thing? How had poison found its way into the holy wine? Suspicion fell naturally on the enslaved community. Who else would dare defile the sacred communion? The master's grief quickly transformed into rage, and that rage demanded a target. Ruth felt the net closing around her with each passing hour. The other enslaved people watched her with new eyes, some with fear, others with something that might have been admiration. She had done what none of them had dared to dream. She had struck back at the heart of the system that bound them all. When they came for her 3 days later, Ruth was ready. She had spent those days in strange peace, knowing that her fate was sealed, but finding satisfaction in the chaos her actions had unleashed. The plantation buzzed with activity as investigators searched for evidence, questioned witnesses, and gradually focused their attention on the quiet woman who worked in the kitchen. The trial, if it could be called that, took place in the courthouse of Milledgeville under the harsh light of Southern justice. Ruth stood before her accusers with dignity and tact, her silence more powerful than any defense attorney could have provided. They presented their evidence, testimony from other enslaved people who had seen her near the communion table, witnesses who swore she had knowledge of poisonous plants, character testimony that painted her as sullen and rebellious. But Ruth never spoke in her own defense. She stood like a statue carved from Georgia marble, beautiful and immovable, letting their accusations wash over her without response. Her silence unnerved the courtroom, judges and spectators alike finding something unsettling in her calm acceptance of her fate. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Ruth finally spoke, her voice clear and strong in the hushed courtroom. "The cup was bitter long before I touched it." Those were the only words she offered, but they hung in the air like smoke, filling the room with their weight. The sentence was death, of course. No other punishment would satisfy the outraged white community. But even as they condemned her, Ruth's accusers seemed shaken by her composure, by the dignity she maintained in the face of certain execution. She had become something they couldn't understand, not the broken slave they expected, but something resembling a prophet of judgment. But here the historical record grows murky, truth blending with legend like morning mist over the Oconee River. Some accounts insist Ruth was hanged from the old oak tree behind the courthouse, her body a warning to any who might follow her example. Others whisper of a different ending, of a woman who vanished from her cell like smoke, leaving behind only chains and the lingering scent of foxglove. The stories multiplied in the years that followed, each telling shaped by the fears and hopes of those who told them. Some said Ruth's spirit haunted the church where she had poisoned the communion wine, that visitors could still hear her footsteps on Easter mornings, still catch glimpses of a figure in rough cotton moving through the shadows. Others claimed she had escaped into the vast Georgia swamplands, aided by a network of supporters who saw her not as a murderer, but as an instrument of divine justice. In this version, Ruth became a ghost of the wetlands, helping other enslaved people find freedom while evading capture herself. She became legend, part woman, part myth, part warning to those who would worship at the altar of human bondage. The enslaved community carried her memory like a secret hymn, singing her story in coded spirituals that spoke of bitter cups and poisoned chalices. She became a symbol of resistance, proof that even the most powerless could strike back at the heart of oppression. Her name was whispered in quarters and fields, passed down through generations like an inheritance of defiance. Years passed, and the church in Milledgeville was rebuilt, its interior cleansed and consecrated anew. A new golden chalice replaced the old one. But those who remembered Easter Sunday of 1852 could never quite shake the feeling that communion wine still carried the taste of judgment. The ritual continued, but forever changed, forever marked by the memory of the day salvation itself was poisoned. Ruth's story became a mirror in which different people saw different truths. To some, she was a cold-blooded killer who defiled the sacred. To others, she was an avenging angel who delivered justice to those who perverted God's love into chains and whips. Perhaps she was both, or perhaps she was something else entirely, a woman pushed beyond endurance who found in poison the only power available to the powerless. The bitter communion she prepared that Easter morning continues to echo through history, a reminder that systems built on human suffering will eventually face their reckoning. Her chalice, whether real or metaphorical, sits empty but not forgotten, waiting for someone to ask the questions it poses. What is justice when law protects injustice? What is murder when life itself has been stolen? What is desecration when humanity is bought and sold like property? Ruth's shadow still moves through the story of America, a ghost of conscience in a house built on bones. Her poison was not the first toxin to corrupt the communion cup of American Christianity, nor was it the last. But her courage to act, to strike back at the heart of a system that claimed God's blessing while practicing the devil's work, marks her as something unique in the annals of resistance. The cup she tainted may have held wine, but it carried something more precious and more dangerous. The undiluted truth that some wounds can never heal, some sins can never be forgiven, and some cups can never offer the salvation they promise. In the end, Ruth's legacy is not the poison she prepared, but the questions she posed. Questions that hang in the air still, waiting for answers that America has yet to provide.